work nationally to undermine public schools. Let's close the gaps across our states and work together to demand better nationwide. And so I'd like the presentees to introduce yourself with your name and your role and your group or organization. And what is one thing that is most concerning or worrying facing public schools in your state right now? So how about Melinda? Would you like to go first?
So I'm actually Sharon Kirsch with Save Our Schools Arizona. Melinda is not joining us this morning. She'll be on the panel later this afternoon. So I'm happy to start if that's okay.
So does somebody want to go first?
Go ahead, Sharon. I don't think she heard you.
Okay, I'll jump in and start if that's all right. I'm Sharon Kirsch. I'm a co-founder and the director of research for Save Our Schools Arizona Network, which is our 501c3, and Save Our Schools Arizona, which is a 501c4. We're both organizations are dedicated to education advocacy across our state. We're grassroots, primarily volunteer-led, with a statewide focus on fighting back against privatization and really trying to prioritize public education in our state. So the question of trying to identify the one thing that is most concerning, it's really difficult in Arizona to just identify one thing because we've been facing 3 decades of privatization, and Arizona has really been used as a petri dish for this stuff. We were the first state in the country to have STO, the tax credit vouchers for private school tuition. We were the first state in the country by design to have ESA, Empowerment Scholarship Account vouchers, which other states call education savings accounts. Now we have all these crazy new fronts in this battle to dismantle our public schools happening in Arizona. And that's what I'll be talking about on my panel this afternoon with Melinda. So I think all of these things combined, the thing that's most concerning to me is that the public school system in Arizona is facing such a tremendous crisis that on my really disheartening days, I worry we just can't come back from it. We have among the lowest per pupil spending. We lose more teachers. We lose 1/3 of our new teachers by their 3rd year of teaching. We have the second highest class sizes in the nation. Of course, the pandemic has just exacerbated all of this stuff. So I think really what worries me most is that we have what sometimes feels like an insurmountable hill to conquer. But having said that, I'm just so grateful to the Wisconsin Summer Summit and all of you guys who put together a truly amazing day, and to include all of us so that we can listen to each other, learn from each other. And I'm excited to hear what other panelists have to say.
I'm operating 2 devices here, I'm sorry. Any other introductions? Nancy, Julie, Cathy? If anyone else wants to introduce yourself.
Good morning, I'm Nancy. I'm Nancy Loome. I'm the executive director of the Parents Campaign in Mississippi. We've been around for 15 years. We are a statewide organization with about 65,000 members. We have both a C3 and a C4 organization, so we can lobby extensively. We do take positions on certain pieces of education legislation. We issue action alerts to our members. We report legislators' votes on those bills, and we post legislators' voting records for the current year and past years for the last 15 years. The one thing that is most concerning in our state right now, of course, we have fought the privatization effort all along. Right now, we seem to have held that at bay for the time being. So the thing that we're really focused on now in Mississippi is a terrible teacher shortage crisis that we have that is driven largely by the fact that we have the lowest teacher salaries in the country. far lower even than our neighboring states of Arkansas and Alabama, Tennessee and Louisiana. And that is particularly worrying because our state Speaker of the House is pushing a proposal to eliminate our state income tax, which makes up 1/3 of our general fund. So we are hyper focused on protecting those funds so that we can pass a teacher pay raise and hopefully stem that teacher shortage.
Cathy, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Cathy Fuentes-Rohwer, and I'm the president of the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, ICPE. We're much like these other organizations. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy group, and we do a lot of the same thing of alerting our members across the state and followers to the legislative agenda that hits us every session. And we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary this summer of keeping education public, attempting to keep education public. And we do things like we give a report card of our legislators, and we give them grades because they're very eager to give our schools grades. So we give them grades on their voting record. But anyway, we have teacher shortage, low salary growth, we're the ALEC poster child for education reform. We have a package of reforms named after us back when Mike Pence was our governor. So I guess the one thing that really is worrying, among many other things, is that Indiana's back on top as the most expansive voucher program in the country. You can make $145,000 a year as a family of 4 and get a 90% ADM voucher from our state. So they've just opened the floodgates. They just started education savings accounts. We have so many ways to send public money into private hands. I can't even count the ways. So that's our big concern, is the privatization and marketization of education.
Thank you, Cathy. Julie or Mary?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Julie Borst. I'm the Executive Director of Save Our Schools New Jersey Community Organizing. We are a 501c3, and we organize an all volunteer parent organization called Save Our Schools New Jersey, and that's really the public-facing entity. We have 37,000 members across the state. We're in every legislative district in our state. And much like the other groups, we've been around for about 10 years. We started as an organization primarily concerned about school funding. During the Christie administration, schools were losing about $1 billion a year. And of course, the consequences of year after year of not having that funding has done an awful lot of damage to our schools. Privatization obviously is an issue. Charter schools in New Jersey, while not as prolific as they are in other states, still do considerable damage to the districts where they operate, particularly in the urban areas where there are many of them. So for instance, Newark loses probably about $250,000 a year or more right off the top of their budget straight into private hands. So we work very hard to try to keep charter schools as visible as possible, because once that money goes into private hands, you really have no idea where it is. And of course, charter schools have their own boards, but violations of Open Public Meetings Act happen regularly in this state. Vouchers, unfortunately, have not been so much of an issue. We've managed to keep those at bay. During the Christie administration many years ago, they tried to create a voucher program. We managed to kill it. And then every year he would put it in the budget, but it became kind of like a joke of it was a bargaining chip. So there wasn't really a serious effort for that. And so far, that's still the case. As far as the one thing that we worry about in the state, if we finally have a governor who's serious about putting money into the funding formula, so that's good. So we're moving, very quickly towards full funding, which is terrific. But I think with the pandemic, there are issues about segregation. There's issues about equity in this state that have persisted since the beginning of time. And the pandemic certainly brought all those things to the forefront. So there's currently a desegregation lawsuit before a state Supreme Court. We're very concerned about that. We're one of 11 states in the country that require some form of an exit exam in order to get a high school diploma. Our current governor had promised to get rid of that. Unfortunately, that has not happened. And we currently now have regulations that are about to make it harder for kids to graduate high school. So there's lots of things going on, and I'm not even sure you can prioritize it as a number one thing. All of it is under assault at this point. So we carry great concern about what happens. And I really feel like at this point, a lot of the anti-masking issues is really noisy, but I think it also points towards, towards leading towards more privatization. So in other words, if you don't like it in your public schools, if they're going to mandate that, go to a private school that won't mandate that, and here's some money to help you go there. So I very much see that as an issue.
Thank you, Julie. And Mary, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yeah, good afternoon, or actually good morning, not good afternoon. My name is Mary Sinclair. I'm with Game On for Kansas Schools. I'm part of the leadership team that's directed by Judith Deedy. And the story of Game On is very similar to the other presenters on this panel. We emerged as a niche advocacy group, nonpartisan, grassroots, all volunteer, parents, teachers, community members, and filled a niche where other advocacy groups and professional organizations were not able to work fast enough, or just needed a louder, faster voice from the parents across the state. And it was triggered by radically reduced state revenues through the tax experiment. I don't know if you caught that in the news in Kansas. And so that led to very significant cuts in public education. And so that really was the trigger for our group to emerge. So, the work we do, educating parents, urging them to participate in the political process. So action alerts and using social media to provide information, evaluating policy that's, hitting the legislative session. Our legislative session runs January to June usually. We work with legislators and trying to talk with them and encouraging members across the state to connect with their legislators. We do vote counts. We're a 501c4, so we don't advocate for partisan elections, but we do put out vote counts about how people stand in relation to public education. The one issue I would say that's probably got us most concerned among many are really the wedge issues that are used in Kansas and across the country for election purposes. So I'll talk later about our school finance. We're actually in a better place than we have been in 20 years for school finance. Charters really have not been an issue. We have pretty solid legislation around that, and an interesting strategy by our commissioner to nullify the threat of charters. But we do have a voucher foothold that was put in place in 2014 through tax credit scholarships. It's defanged, but there's always that potential if you get enough legislators in to blow that open. So, we're battling probably like you all are, CRT, mask policy, and the other one was the participation of trans students in high school sports. So trying to educate people around those wedge issues and to get out and vote and pay attention to who they're sending to the Capitol is our issue, probably of most concern.
Thank you, Mary. We'll move on then to what's working. If you could share an example of organizing in your state that had a positive impact for students in public schools. How did you do it? How did you know you were successful? If you haven't had a big win yet, what are you most proud of, and what gives you the most hope for your state?
I'm happy to jump in and start this part off. So our biggest win comes with 20 years of persistence. So to some, it might not feel like a win because it took so dang long. But it is a huge win. So my kids went through school without constitutional funding, and but so in Kansas we had two major lawsuits that spanned 20 years, and the way it's resolved, because the first lawsuit basically was reneged on. So there was a group of a handful of school districts that came and argued that the schools were unconstitutionally funded and the dollars were distributed inequitably. There was a resolution to that after about 10 years or about 7 years, called the Montoy case. That was resolved. Then the Great Recession hit and the legislature reneged. So another lawsuit was brought, the Gannon lawsuit. That took another 10 years, but the courts retained jurisdiction because they reneged on the first one. So we are 2 years away from constitutional funding. And because of that 20-year span, the courts were very informed, because it was triggered, the second lawsuit, by such dramatic cuts to not only the schools, but across the state. We lost 15 to 20% of our revenue, kind of much that sounds like Mississippi might be facing. That woke up more than just public education advocates, because, we had a funding crisis year after year after year from the state on down. So that lawsuit allowed a solidification, I think, of advocacy groups as well as professional organizations. So starting at about 2011, these advocacy groups started meeting on a regular basis to form a unified message, so we could really get across to people the significance and the threat that we were facing. And that unification exists today. And the Game On for Kansas Schools emerged because the parent group was led mostly by the PTA, and I'm actually part of that Kansas PTA leadership as well, but we operate by committee. So you couldn't engage fast enough to all the shenanigans that were happening in the midnight hour. The bills that are this long and nobody reads, and they're passed at 2 a.m. and boom, things change. So unfortunately, things had to get really bad, I think, for folks to come together. But moving forward, those groups remained nonpartisan, stuck to the facts, stuck to the issues, built trust over time, continued to collaborate. And so I think that's, evolved into a network of people who can really triage across the state. So if it's superintendents that need to talk to legislators, if it's parents that need to talk to some other group, we have a network we can really mobilize, and then also keep new people informed as they roll along. The other piece I wanted to mention is that the Kansas Constitution is written in a way that has two really key components that helped us win in the courts. So we have a very informed Supreme Court leadership, but the way the Constitution is written is that the legislature is not only responsible for suitable funding, but they have to show improvement in outcomes. So we were able to use and partner with those of you in New Jersey who know Bruce Baker. He started in Kansas before he moved to Rutgers. So he was a part of this piece and really introduced the whole concept of cost function analysis and really linking funding to outcomes in a data-based, data-informed way. So that has been kind of a backbone, that component of the Constitution, and using an informed decision-making process about funding. So we are 2 years away from constitutional funding, and we're very excited about that. And hopefully the formula will remain in place with kind of that persistent, adequate, and equitable funding formula.
I think that's huge.
Pass the baton.
Yeah, that's really that really says something, right? And I think just your example and the amount of time that we have been around, and Nancy has been doing this too. This is they always say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and that is absolutely the case, really, with any policy, any public policy, but particularly in education. And I think one of the challenging things is getting parents in particular to understand, because we talk about these things in nonpartisan terms, but it's really important to understand that it can be, a Democrat or Republican can be your ally, and they can also be your enemy. And so it makes navigating this sometimes a little bit complicated. And Nancy, I'm sure, can tell lots of stories about how there are tremendous, public education advocates who happen to be Republicans in her state. And then there are other states where it's the exact opposite. And the same goes for Democrats. You really kind of have to get your head wrapped around that. So whichever way you lean, you may or may not have advocates who think like you do politically. I think some of our bigger wins have been, during the introduction of Common Core state standards, and New Jersey was one of the states that started with the PARCC exams. We were able to minimize some of the impact of those things. New Jersey was actually looking to do PARCC all the way down through kindergarten. So we managed to get a law passed that kept it out of the K-2 space, which was good. New Jersey does do more testing than is federally required. We lobby very heavily to have New Jersey cut back to be just the federal minimums. And like I said, too, we also have a high school exit exam. We did manage to get regulations for a while that minimize some of the damage of that, make it a little bit easier, give kids more avenues in order to be able to graduate. As I said, we're fighting that right now because it looks like they're about to make it that much harder. Education Law Center is based here in New Jersey. They've brought lawsuits of varying kinds. And not the least of which was about our high school graduation regs. So up through this next class of 2022, they're protected and have many pathways to graduate. After that, not so much. I think, relationship building certainly helps. We have tremendous champions in our legislature, and I think that's really important. Mary touched on this a little bit too, where they have relationships with other organizations, statewide organizations, and professional organizations in your state. If you can do that, that's incredibly helpful as well. There are certainly times when those organizations can throw their weight behind things, and that definitely helps. And as parents, you can help them amplify what their issues are as well as it relates to your children. And that can be incredibly powerful. So I think, the relationship building that we've done over the last, 10 plus years has made an impact on things, because now they're curious and they come to us and they want to know what we think. So before any piece of legislation hits, people are calling and asking us what we think the impact on our kids are going to be. And that's incredibly important. It definitely takes time. You do have to be patient with this, for sure.
I'll go next. In Mississippi, one of our biggest wins was a couple of years ago. It was the defeat of a bill that would have changed our school funding formula. So in Mississippi, we actually have a very strong school funding formula. It's one of the most equitable in the country. But it is currently underfunded statewide by about $270 million. And so this is an issue that comes back to haunt legislators during election season every year, and they don't like it. So our Speaker of the House, again featuring the Speaker of the House, drafted a bill that would have, in essence, made the current level of funding full funding. It was basically an effort to say what we're doing now is great, even though it's our per student expenditure in Mississippi is far below that of most states. And so his proposal, the new formula he proposed, would have cost school districts hundreds of millions of dollars statewide. So his proposal called for, the bill that he proposed called for this new formula to be phased in over 5 years. So he claimed that school districts would see increased funding from his bill, because what he was doing was comparing what his new formula would provide 5 years down the road to what public schools were getting in the current year. And he called in each of the representatives individually and showed them on his spreadsheet how much money their school districts would gain if they just voted for his bill. So what we did was to show that his numbers were wrong. We ran the numbers to determine what the existing formula that was in law would provide each school district 5 years down the road, and then got that word out. So we created, and then of course there were huge losses for every school district. So for each school district, we created a graphic that showed how much their district would lose if the speaker's bill was passed. We ran those on our website, on all of our social media platforms, and we wrote op-ed pieces that we sent to local newspapers, and each one was customized for the circulation area of that local newspaper. We listed in the article how much each of the school districts in the newspaper circulation area would lose if the speaker's bill was passed. And of course, we issued many action alerts for people to call their legislators about it, but that localized information that parents could pick up and use to call their legislators about, and we explained to them what the difference was and what the speaker was saying and what the reality was, that he was using numbers 5 years down the road for his formula, and 5 years back, the current underfunding level, not even what the current formula would require, but the underfunding level. And so that bill was defeated in the Senate. It was a big win for us.
Thank you, Nancy. Anyone else?
I'll
I'll
go.
jump in.
Oh, who's that? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Cathy.
Okay. Yeah, because maybe you actually have a win you can describe. So I will go and talk about the little tiny points of progress that we can discuss. So ICPE, we host a lunch bunch during legislative session, and even infrequently not, with Superintendents Association, School Boards Association, Teachers Association. So all of the people, Rural Schools Association and urban schools, to just sort of discuss what we see coming down. And then, and a lot of it is the lobbyists or the heads of those organizations to talk about what's going on. And for a long time, I was kind of surprised and frustrated to hear everybody doing their own thing. And I think we started off this session when we were looking at the massive expansion of privatization. And on our board for ICPE, we have 3 former state superintendents, and 2 of them are Republican and 1 is a Democrat. And they are very well respected in their field, all of them former teachers. And they really represent the nonpartisan nature of public education advocacy. That these 3 women are tremendous public education advocates, are not getting caught up in the partisan nature of it. And our most recent one, when she decided not to run again, she was the last elected superintendent for our state ever in the last 150 years, because Indiana made it a governor appointed position now. So everything education is governor appointed. The state board of education is governor appointed, and so is she. And before that, it was a way for Republicans to voice what they felt about education separate from all the other issues that their party might stand for. Without that opportunity, that was very clever of them, because now they have complete control in the legislature. So we had our 3 superintendents come out and speak as a unified voice for public education against the expansion of choice and why we need to keep public funds in public schools. And after that, and or maybe sort of simultaneously, the Indiana School Boards Association, which is the nonpartisan public of public education, which has been not very active, became quite politically active in this case. And over half of them passed resolutions against the education savings account that was getting established and against the expansion of vouchers. That was huge for rural, mostly Republican school districts, and then, you know, suburban school districts that are quite Republican. And because for a long time, it was just sort of keep on keeping on and not call out what was happening, and sort of be willing to think that this is just an urban schools problem and not theirs. And so I think it was a wake up call to our legislature, even though the school choice people got what they wanted in the end, the massive expansion. And we got a really good deal on the budget for the first time in 10 years, partly because the federal funding came flooding in and they were able to give us some and point to that. But well, they didn't point to the federal funding actually, but they were able to point to, like, look how much more we're giving you. In 2 years, when that federal funding kind of dries out, we're going to see a real stark situation here with the expansion of choice and public funds going to private hands. So I think that the positive is that there are people speaking up and speaking out and recognizing that that they need to speak up for public education, people who never, ever would have done it before, and recognizing that politics is not just partisan, because as New Jersey is pointing out, like, Democrats are just as guilty in our cities. There's tons of charter issues here with public schools or test-driven accountability, but it's important for voices that can't be maligned as, oh, they're just in bed with the teacher union. Like, voices for public ed that are a little bit more neutral and nonpartisan in their view, speaking out like that. So that's our win.
I'll follow up on that and touch on some of the things that others of you have said. The Save Our Schools Arizona has kind of a unusual origin story, because we started with a huge win. We didn't exist before 2017, and really what brought us together was the appointment of Betsy DeVos as U.S. Secretary of Education, and that really got a lot of us paying attention in a way that we hadn't been before, and especially at the state level. And as a mom with 2 kids in school, I had a good sense that things were not good in Arizona, that they were really bad. I'm an educator myself. I'm a professor at ASU, at Arizona State University, as is my spouse. We even looked to leave the state because we were concerned about educating our kids in Arizona. But I had no point at that sense how bad it really was and why it was so bad. But we started paying attention, ran into other people at the state legislature, listening at the education committee hearings. And when they tried to pass what would have been the first universal ESA voucher program in the United States in Arizona in 2016, we just were floored that they would do. How could they possibly do that when our teachers, like, literally didn't have printing copy paper for the copy machines after February, and they stopped printing things. You know, it was just crazy, the level of underfunding in our state. And so then we started to realize, like, oh, why do people want this voucher bill so badly? And honestly, at that point, we didn't even know you could refer legislation to the ballot in Arizona. When this bill passed by 1 vote, after a big fight and after it was amended, we Googled, how do you refer a bill in Arizona? And we had 90 days to gather enough signatures and get that universal voucher expansion bill on the ballot. And people in our state, hands down, support public education. There is no question about that. So the people in the state of Arizona voted by a 2-to-1 margin, a huge margin, against universal voucher expansion. And it was, nobody believed, in fact, we almost didn't believe, Save Our Schools didn't believe we would be successful, but we thought, you know what, we've learned so much in the last 3 months that has just opened our eyes. Even if we don't win by getting this bill on the ballot, we can still just talk to people and just find out what they're thinking, see if they know what's going on, try to fill in some of the gaps for them. And so that's really what we did. And I really think that is what worked then and what has always worked for us, just mobilizing thousands of volunteers across the state. And that's really what gives me hope. Our victories since that big success have been smaller and harder fought, because even though the people of Arizona said in no uncertain terms, they do not want Private school vouchers expanded. Our legislature again and again and again has tried. We've been able to fight back a number of things that have come through the legislature, but not all. And I think the most important thing we've learned in this process is that it really is out of state and also in-state special interest groups, extremely well funded. So I'm talking about, the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, have had a lobbying office in Arizona, full-time lobbyists on the ground here for almost 2 decades. The American Federation for Children, which is DeVos funded, same thing. The newest Koch organization, education reform organization called Yes Every Kid, this year for the first time has had a full-time lobbyist on the ground here. They were successful in getting something passed that never would have passed if they hadn't been here. So I think we have just really understood how much there's a disconnect between what the people of Arizona want and what's actually happening in our communities, in our public schools, and in our legislature. So a lot of things that you guys said, I really liked Kansas, just sort of slow and steady. That gives me hope to think, okay, even if we can't win everyone, the more people we can pull in, the more relationships we can build, which Save Our Schools has done from day one, really out of necessity, because we didn't know anything. So I was Googling national organizations fighting privatization, and I somehow ran across Nancy Loome's name and called Nancy and said, Nancy, you have to explain this stuff to me, and read their website. And, so I think just building those relationships, Save Our Schools has been super successful with social media and communications. We've also built kind of levels of volunteers. So we have a core group of superhero volunteers, we call them, and they're just the people who've been with us from day one. They're kind of as crazy as we are. They can't ever let it go. They're kind of always in it. And then we have other people who kind of show up and disappear and show up. So they're there, but maybe not every single second, but we keep in touch with them. And when they have the energy and they can hop in, they do, and we know they're there. And then we just focus on building relationships with new people and new communities all across the state.
Thank you, everyone. We should be moving on to what's worrying. I'm looking at the clock and it's 10:45 Wisconsin time. So if you have maybe a quick response to what lessons have you learned from fights you did not win, or from small wins that felt like losses, and what can we learn from mistakes you've made in your advocacy efforts? And then we'll move on to what's next. But if we could do that a little bit on what's worrying, and what lesson would you like to pass on to those of us who are also in this tough fight for public education?
So I'll go first with that. So this is not so much a New Jersey specific thing, although certainly we have experienced this. I think that one of the more frustrating things, and if you pay attention just to politics in general, I'm sure you see this as well, but this seems to be particularly so around public education. Depending upon the legislators you're dealing with, you could have piles and piles and piles of peer-reviewed evidence, either for or against whatever it is that they're trying to do, and it makes absolutely no difference. And it is incredibly frustrating. And I know that teachers obviously have felt this for a very, very long time, because they're in the middle of it, having been trained in the profession and hearing just all the crazy latest, whatever the gimmick is, if you buy this, if you do that, if you don't do this, this is going to cure all of the ills. And by the way, it's going to save you a ton of money and you can educate kids for $6,000 a year or something ridiculous like that, right? I think just as a general warning to everybody, as you are advocating for whatever it is, you should absolutely be showing up with all of that peer-reviewed information. And sometimes you're going to have to do it for years. And sometimes you're probably going to be writing testimony and just changing the date, because virtually nothing has changed. But it's still important to show up and to have those things be on record, because you don't want anybody ever to be able to say with a straight face, well, we didn't know because nobody told us. And that's my 2 cents worth of wisdom in this, having been in this fight for more than 10 years myself personally, but for Save Our Schools New Jersey, I mean, this is the lesson that we keep learning. And in our own state, some of the gatekeeper legislators, unfortunately, are, they get money from KIP, they get money from, from very well-funded sources who are very dedicated to making sure that test companies are still making money, that there is a pathway to privatization in the state, and that stays open. And so it doesn't matter what you present that person with, they are always, no matter what, going to come down on the other side. Which kind of leads into this other thing. I mean, we have not created a 501c4, but for those places, for those states who have done that, for those organizations who have done that, you should absolutely be using that to start looking for candidates to start to run, because ultimately that's what it's going to take.
I'll go next. So in Mississippi, the only voucher fight that we've ever lost was in an election year. And once again, the culprit was the Speaker of the House. He had it was a ESA voucher program for children with special needs to go for tuition for private schools. And we had the votes to kill it the week before the vote, but the Speaker, who was in support of the bill, called in the representatives in his own party and threatened to fund primary opponents to run against them if they did not vote in favor of the bill. And so he was really brutal in those threats, and we lost enough votes to lose the votes on that bill. So what we learned from that, prior to that, almost all of our efforts had been grassroots, building our network and issuing action alerts and counting on our people to call their legislators and put pressure on them, which of course we did for that bill too. But what we learned was that our relationships with legislators were also really important. They needed to believe that we would have their backs in a primary election, and that they could prevail running on a public education platform, no matter the party, in the primary, even when state leaders oppose them. And so we really have made a concerted effort to deepen those relationships and to have our members talk with their legislators in a different way, to not ever be antagonistic or hostile, but to develop very, very positive relationships with them so that legislators know that they are in their corner.
I'll go next. I think it just ties into sort of what you were talking about as far as, or what we've been talking about as far as the developing relationships. We really need to highlight, that politics, the political nature of this politics is about your relationship to power, and our public schools are in a power struggle right now for whether they stay afloat anymore. So we definitely are trying to be very mindful of being supportive of Republican voices who speak up for their public schools. Because before, I don't know, for me at least, and I'm down in Bloomington, Indiana, which is the Indiana University home. And so you're in this blue dot and you kind of forget and you get a little feisty. So trying to be much more mindful and find where the common ground is, that's something that we're really, what I'm worried about is that they're not really looking at using test scores in our state so much as a way of killing public schools, because they figured out that actually didn't really work, and that these private schools don't do as well as the public schools at all, even though they get to pick their students, go figure. So now it is this culture war that we were talking about. Now it is, if your kid goes to that school, that's for liberals. And I really feel like if we lose the narrative that public schools are not for everyone, but actually just liberal ideologies and they're Democrat institutions, we will lose our fight for sure. And then maybe I'll run carpool more often. But I mean, at this point, that's our really big fight, is that national narrative, which is so well funded and so well organized, is coming in everywhere. They've got a billboard up in Indiana. They're called Purple for Parents here, and they're well funded, and they are getting people hysterical, because I'm also a school board member. So I'm starting to see some of those letters coming from people. We're like, show us Like they set a FOIA out. They want to see every single thing we teach. They're trying to get records of every single thing we teach so they can see the critical race theory. So anyway, that worries me, because that could be very successful, because we created the pipeline for them to go to private schools, and we keep doing it private ways, privately run schools and charters or whatever. But now you'll get the incentive, the really great incentive to get out of public schools.
So I'll follow up on that in a way that might take us a little bit into what I think is the last question. But Cathy, like you, Arizona tried to pass a law that would have required our teachers to post every single thing they were going to teach in advance. And a lot of it's posted in public anyway, but that luckily didn't go through. But I can't underscore enough what you and others have said about the importance of maintaining this as a nonpartisan effort. Because I think when you take all the money and the special interests out of it, it truly is nonpartisan. So many of us went to public schools, loved that public school down the street from us, went to our fall festivals there, all of that great stuff that our public schools do for our communities beyond educating our kids. And so I think this is a particular battle in Arizona. And one of the things that we are very focused on, we've always been an organization very focused on being nonpartisan, and have made people angry on all sides, which is good, we think. Like we want to keep pushing this as a nonpartisan issue, but we know that really to make lasting change in Arizona, what we have to do, the biggest lesson we know now, is that we have to change the legislature and get it filled with people, regardless of party, people who genuinely support public education. Sadly, in our last election, we lost 2 of our moderate Republicans, one to a Democrat who was a former teacher of the year. So that was great, but still we lost a moderate Republican voice. And the other moderate Republican to a totally crazy QAnon person, like so extreme. And so that's very, very difficult in our legislature. But one of the things we see our organization doing is trying to connect the dots for people and making sure they understand how the votes that their representatives cast in the legislature actually impact their schools and their public schools. And so helping people make well-informed choices, getting good candidates to run, definitely. But we really believe that if we can't change our legislature, we are not going to be able to save our schools. So that is I think our primary focus at this point. We have moved into a new phase of community organizing for us. We have community action teams across the state led by people in those communities. And as an organization, we try to just help whatever those particular communities need. If we can provide them information or data or people or presentations, whatever they need, we try our best to present, to offer that to them so they can be effective in their communities and understand the issues and really fight to keep public funds in the public schools in their areas.
Okay, I'll be extremely brief. Cathy, I think, articulated a Kansas fear pretty pretty identically to what we're concerned about in Kansas. And the partisanship as a way of undermining people's confidence in public education is a major concern. And the wedge issues are kind of what I noted before, are used to drum up that. I apologize on behalf of Kansas and the 2 brothers who are causing a lot of these problems across the country. They are very well funded in Kansas. And and I'm also a school board member as well. So I see it in the emails and on a regular basis. So that is a major concern. And Sharon, I think I really like the way you articulated just helping people connect the dots. That's what we will continue to do, is helping people connect the dots. Game On for Kansas Schools has actually always been a coalition kind of builder. So Kansas is a small state, so we probably have 15,000 followers on Facebook, but our state is maybe not quite 3 million people in the state of Kansas, so it's a smaller state. But the approach that the we have always taken has been about supporting coalitions, local coalitions across the state, rather than, a one big membership. So again, trying to work not only with other parent groups in connecting on common messages, but we're also an active part of the professional organizations so that collectively we are all hitting the same message and identifying and prioritizing the same concerns.
Thank you, advocates. How about if we go to questions and the discussion? What can we do together? And if those that are on virtually on the Zoom, if you want to put questions in the chat, and then I'm going to go on mute and see if we have questions from our 10 attendees at this session within, we're all together here in a classroom. So we'll kind of look at that. Oh,
Just a question about how people have thought about structuring their membership organizations. Lessons learned there. Thought it was really helpful. Sharon kind of laid that out a little bit for Arizona.
mhm.
Thought it was Julie who mentioned like they have 36,000 members. So is this Julie or anyone else how they've thought about structuring the organization in a way that can engage a lot of people?
That was Dan Grandoni, and he's, I don't know if you could hear him from the speaker on this computer. Just wondering, how we can, if you have ideas about strengthening the coalition within your different organizations.
Less on coalitions, more like people who have actual members or people like similar to what Sharon shared, but maybe more pointedly to Julie in New Jersey. How have they engaged 36,000 members and by a structure that enabled that to work versus not?
Well, I'll jump in from Mississippi. We have about 65,000 members, and somebody in the chat asked how we got those. And we actually have an angel investor. I had started doing this work about 20 years ago as a volunteer, and we ended up getting a lot of media attention. And I was approached by this wonderful man who is a great supporter of public education and offered funding. So we have decent funding for our organization from a man who's willing to just write a check and not get any tax benefit from it. So we have people on staff whose job it is to go out into our local school districts, and we ask principals and superintendents to help us identify their most involved parents, because we know that there are some parents who would not be the ones that they would want speaking up on behalf of their school districts. They allow us in many school districts to send sign-up forms home in book bags of elementary children for their parents to be able to sign up. We go speak at PTA and PTO events. I think it's Arizona that has, somebody else said that they had a similar organization where they have their super volunteers. We identify a super volunteer in every single school district who helps us spread our network locally in that school district. We also, when we issue action alerts, call those super volunteers and say, check your email. We just sent an action alert. Please make sure you get at least 20 phone calls out from your district. So those are some ideas of ways, but we are constantly working on refreshing that network because people get tired, especially 15 years in. Very few of the people who are our most involved people now were our most involved people 15 years ago.
And I would just follow up on that. We don't have members, but we do work on increasing our numbers. So we have nearly 80,000 people on our email list. we have over 1,000 people of the superheroes, the group of people we know personally, we know well, we stay in touch with. And then because that started to get so big, that's why we've kind of done the community action teams. So people from within that group have now become leaders in their communities. And because, we can't know everybody, but we have had tremendous success on social media. And have expanded. Facebook is huge for us. So that's why we started the superheroes group, so that when there were issues that we didn't necessarily want to just put out in the public, but we wanted our closest people to know, we put that stuff in social media. We may package it differently when we put an email out calling for people to contact their legislators or some other kind of action alert. But we definitely have kind of a multi-tiered communication strategy, both internally and externally. And a lot of it for us has just been what's worked in the past. We keep doing. If it doesn't work, we try something else. But we also talk to people like we're doing today and find out what's working in other states and see if we can replicate it or grab an idea that's been useful to them. That has been so helpful to us. It's been a little tricky because we started as a 501c4 after we ran that ballot referral. And then we became a 501c3, and we don't have an angel investor. I wish we did. We've had a little bit of success getting some grants, but we primarily remain a volunteer organization. But the grants that we have gotten have allowed us to translate our materials into Spanish and do some outreach in the Native communities across our state.
Kansas is a total volunteer organization as well. I would say, just to add to the continuity, I would say the focus on policy has been what's allowed people to stay with it and stay focused and to follow along on the issues, because really the legislators are going after the same issues year after year after year, whether it's privatization and cutting taxes really seems to be, right, the two dominant themes. If you are kind of a no tax, approach things from a no tax ideology, that's 50% of any state budget. So they're coming after public education because it's the biggest line item. So it really has nothing to do with public education as much as I think it does about taxes for a big majority of folks. And then you have the ideological pieces woven into that, and that also, those two forces together, I think are have been causing lots of problems. But I'm sorry, I'm digressing. The focus on policy seems to be what keeps people connected, and it's easier because they keep hitting the same themes over and over again. So I kind of find their repetition to be their Achilles heel in many ways of keeping folks engaged and understanding just enough to understand what kind of negative impact that will have on them if the schools really do go under.
Sorry, I missed the question. I had some technical difficulties and hopped on my pad here. I caught Sharon talking about angel investors. So we have been lucky enough to have grants that have kept us going, but it's a struggle to find anybody who wants to fund advocacy. So even, major foundations who are interested in advocacy work are not even, it's very, very hard to keep this funded. We do some small drives annually asking our membership to contribute, and we do get some money that way. And all of that money really goes just to help us pay for software that helps us track legislation and things like that, but also funds of social media things, and the ability to pay for action networks so we can do action alerts and things like that. It's definitely not an easy thing to do. I will say this about our membership though, and I think this is really important. So we have a little over 37,000 members statewide, and they come from every background you can possibly think of, and they are of every political stripe. And so for us, that really drives home, and we're able to convey this to legislators, and that is, it doesn't matter where you fall on the political spectrum. Public schools are incredibly important to people. And they need to remain as such. And I think at this point, you know, a lot of discussion, I think, has to go back to some real basics about what is a public good, and what is the purpose of public education. And it's not about taking a standardized test and passing. It really is about creating citizens who are engaged and able to think and able to participate in some form of a meaningful way. So those things are all really difficult.
In the chat, Nancy, Heather is asking about how you identify and support super volunteers. It's an amazing model. Could you speak more to that?
Yes, I was just typing an answer in the chat, but it's getting long, so I'll just tell you. So one of the things that we have found, we use, Sharon's right, social media is awesome, and we mine social media for those people. We look at comments on our own posts and other people's posts to, you know, to find people and then reach out to them through direct messages. But one of the things that we have found to be the most successful is if I'll go and meet individually with school district superintendents, local superintendents, and explain to them that we are looking for great parent volunteers to develop relationships with their legislators. And I say to them, I understand that sometimes the first people to volunteer for such a thing might not be the people you really want speaking on behalf of your school district. And they always, you know, you can just see on their faces that they are thinking of those parents that are the constant complainers, that they do not want to be the ones. So I say, we want you to help us identify the right people in your district so that we don't get the wrong ones. And, you know, maybe it's principals who can help us do that. And always they say, yes, I'm going to tell my principals to each send you the name of their very best parent volunteer, so that, because they care. When you frame it for them that way, they really want you to choose the right people, not the wrong people. So, because we can't know all the people in all of these school districts, of course. We do vet these people to the degree that we can on social media and through our current, we want teams of them in local districts. And so we ask our current strong volunteers if they know these people. We check out their Facebook pages and Twitter and Instagram and just see if there's anything alarming on there before we reach out to them. But that's how we really work it and nurture it and reach out to these people. We've also started doing what we call insider updates virtually for these people to make them feel special. People love to think that they have insider information. And so we have these kind of invitation only Zoom opportunities for them to know what we're hearing from our inside sources inside the legislature. Somebody else I saw, just real quickly, I saw that somebody posted in the chat a question: are you really finding Republicans who support public education? Mm-hmm. Yes, that is one of our real strategies, is to make sure that we get our local people to go out and recruit and support. Of course, we don't use our funds to support people in elections, but to get our local volunteers to recruit and support strong candidates in those primary elections. And in the last statewide election, we elected a much, much more public education friendly legislature and a fabulous Republican lieutenant governor, and it has been a game changer for us. You can do that. Even in Mississippi, we can do it. You can do it.
That surprises me in Indiana, because while we have they have a super duper majority here. We hear back from a lot of legislators that are Republican that support public education that they don't want to go on the record to do so, because they're worried they're going to get primaried by people who are like QAnon even further, and they're funded as well. And this agenda of privatization in public ed is so entrenched in our state legislature now after a decade of reforms that is considered their party's platform, I think, in many ways, is a parent's right to choose, We fund students, not systems, was constantly the refrain last legislative session. And so we're hardly able to get people to come and just participate in our general annual meeting that we're having this August, to try to find any legislators that actually got above a C in our report card for public ed that were Republican, that would just come and talk about the importance of public schools. We have like 3, I think, that we can, and one has a conflict. But anyway, so I like seeing I'm amazed at what you're doing with the parents and recruiting and everything like that. And I know we need to pay more attention to trying to find those Republicans that are willing to speak out. But I just keep hearing about people who are taken to the woodshed, get kicked off committees if they do. So
That I appreciate that nuance that you both have just talked about. The so in 2014 in Kansas, that's very much an issue for moderate Republicans in Kansas, and we had probably the biggest increase in moderate Republicans in 2016. They got wiped out in 2018, including the moderate Republican who I mentioned in the chat, who actually championed bringing the state constitution back to full funding and fully equitable to pass constitutional muster. And she got voted out in a blue wave. So the nuance in which you have to approach modification of some of the bills. So, for example, the tax credit scholarship was embedded in 2014. I don't know if we'll ever get rid of it because, right, those Republicans feel like they would lose and be primaried if they went after it. So we work on defanging it. So keeping it out of, so right now ours is just for elementary. It's not for high school. So keeping it out of high school, keeping them to their original rationale for having the program, for meeting the needs of at-risk students. So anytime they try to blow it open for just anybody, you can come back and talk about the impact that might have on local communities and their economy if they start shifting all those funds to the private schools. So there are bills for which I think most public education advocates would love to see gone, but knowing that it's politically not tolerable and you're going to lose those moderate folks, trying to convey to people across the state kind of this notion of moderation. It's a tough line to walk, but it's really critical. It's really important. And prioritizing which issues you're going to go after as well.
We are approaching 11:15. I'd like to take the time to thank Sharon, Nancy, Julie, Cathy, and Mary for joining this conversation from across our great nation. And along with our 10 attendees here in person, 11, Heather's here with me now with us. And thank you to everyone who has joined us